So let's dive into a fascinating scenario.
Mm.
What if Canada just up and decided to become the 51st state?
Mm.
I know it sounds crazy, right?
Yeah.
But this idea, I mean, it's been popping up everywhere lately. You see these heated Twitter threads,
Oh, yeah.
and then you've got people like Kevin O'Leary weighing in. Even Donald Trump made a joke about it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So it's obviously not going to happen.
Right.
But exploring the idea, I think, is a fun thought experiment.
It really is. And it's one of those things that reveals a lot about the relationship, between the U.S. and Canada. And it's a good way to kind of think through how statehood actually works.
Exactly. So we've got a ton of articles and research here,
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to unpack all the different angles. Like, what are people actually saying about this? Is anyone actually serious?
Mm-hmm.
And how would this even happen? And what would the real world impact be? The good, the bad, and the totally unexpected.
Well, let's start with just like the buzz. Social media is buzzing about this. And it runs the gamut. So you've got some people like Kevin O'Leary who are totally focused on the potential economic benefits, especially the idea of shared currency.
Yeah, but wouldn't that also mean Canada loses control over its own monetary policy?
Oh.
I mean, what happens if the U.S. Federal Reserve, they make a decision that's good for the U.S. economy,
Yeah.
but bad for Canada's?
That's a great point. It really highlights how even the seemingly good stuff, it has these trade-offs. And not everybody is, gung-ho about the economic side. There are a lot of concerns about how a merger would impact Canadian industries, especially if they suddenly had to compete with much larger U.S. companies, on a completely level playing field.
It's like opening the floodgates all of a sudden.
Right.
You have this massive influx of goods and services
Yeah.
flowing both ways. It's hard to predict who comes out on top.
Exactly. And then beyond economics, there's this huge cultural piece. Some Canadians are worried about losing their distinct identity if they were to join the U.S.
But haven't the two cultures already been blending for decades?
Yeah.
Especially with, all the media we consume from each other. Would this really be such a drastic shift?
Yeah, that's a valid question. Maybe it's more about this perceived loss of autonomy
Yeah.
than a total, cultural takeover. And speaking of autonomy, let's not forget the political earthquake this would cause. I mean, imagine you throw Canadian senators and electoral votes into the mix.
Wow. It's like adding this whole new political force
Yeah.
into the U.S. system. And this is something people are already talking about, especially with how Canada leans more liberal on a lot of issues.
Right.
I mean, do you think this could actually shift the balance of power in the U.S.?
It's possible. You remember when Trump made that 51st state quip? Even as a joke, it sparked a lot of discussion about how Canadian voters could really impact U.S. politics.
Yeah.
But before we get too carried away with the what ifs, maybe you should back up and walk through how this could even happen logistically.
Okay, yeah. So let's get into the nitty-gritty. I mean, is there actually a process for a whole country to just become a U.S. state?
There is.
Yeah.
And it's surprisingly complex. So first and foremost, Canada would have to actually want this. I mean, we're talking national referendum, a vote by the entire country on this one issue. And in this case, the stakes would be incredibly high.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine the campaigns, the debates, the potential for division within Canada.
Wow.
It would be a huge undertaking.
Absolutely. And would it be just a simple majority vote? Or would they need some kind of supermajority for something this big?
That's a good question. It would really depend on how Canada's constitution addresses such a significant change. It's possible they would need agreement from every single province, not just a national majority.
Wow, so this is already getting complicated.
Yeah.
But even if Canada cleared that hurdle, they'd still need the U.S. to be on board too, right?
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. Congress has the final say on admitting new states. It requires approval from both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And for some decisions, they actually need a supermajority in the Senate, which can be incredibly difficult to get.
So it's not as simple as Canada just knocking on the door and saying, hey, let us in.
Yeah.
There are a lot of potential roadblocks along the way.
Exactly. And even if they got through all of that, historically, new states have also held their own referendums just to be extra sure that the public actually supports joining the union. So it wouldn't just be a decision made by politicians. It would need buy-in from people on both sides of the border.
That makes sense. It's such a huge decision with lasting consequences. You want to make sure everybody has a voice. But okay, let's say hypothetically, all of that does happen. Canadians vote for it. The U.S. Congress approves it. The people give it the thumbs up. What happens next?
Then we enter the realm of really mind-boggling ripple effects. It's not just about redrawing a line on a map. We're talking about integrating two entire countries, each with its own complex systems and cultures.
The
Right.
political, economic, and social ramifications would be massive.
Okay, now I'm really hooked. Where do we even begin to unpack all of that?
Well, a good place to start is with the political landscape. I mean, imagine all of a sudden you've got this whole new block of Canadian senators and representatives. And given Canada's political leanings, how do you think that would impact things like legislation and elections?
Well, it seems like it could definitely shift the balance of power in Congress, potentially giving more leverage to certain political agendas, but could it also lead to more gridlock if these new Canadian politicians have different priorities than their U.S. counterparts?
That's a great question. And it's one that would really depend on a lot of factors,
Yeah.
but it definitely highlights how there's potential for both opportunity and disruption.
It's like shaking up a snow globe. You know things are going to change,
Mhm.
but you can't predict exactly how it'll all settle.
That's a great analogy. And it's not just the political landscape that would be affected. We would also see ripple effects in the economy, in defense, and of course in culture. Okay, I'm ready to dive deeper into all of that, but maybe we should save that for part 2 of this deep dive, so we can give each of those aspects the attention they deserve.
I agree. There's a lot to unpack here, and it's worth taking our time to really explore each facet thoroughly. So picking up where we left off, let's dig into some of these potential ripple effects. If this merger were to actually happen, as we said, it's not just lines on a map, it's entire systems colliding.
It's like mixing two completely different recipes together
Yeah,
and hoping it turns out edible, right?
exactly. You've got different ingredients, different cooking styles. You're not even sure if everyone at the table wants the same thing.
Right.
So where do we even begin to analyze something this massive?
Well, you mentioned defense and culture earlier. Those seem like good places to start, since they're so tied to national identity.
Excellent point. Let's start with defense. On paper, merging the U.S. and Canadian military sounds pretty impressive. Streamlined cooperation, shared resources, a unified command structure. Sounds pretty formidable, right?
It does. But wouldn't true integration also mean aligning foreign policy? Historically, the U.S. and Canada haven't always seen eye to eye on every global issue.
Right.
So how would that play out?
That's the crucial question. Military cooperation is one thing, but imagine having to present a united front on the world stage, even when there are disagreements on how to approach a situation.
Yeah.
And that's not even considering the impact on existing alliances.
Right. What happens in NATO? Canada's a founding member. The U.S. plays a major role. But would a unified North America even fit within that framework? And what about NORAD, the joint U.S.-Canadian organization, responsible for aerospace warning and control? Would that even need to exist anymore?
These are the kinds of questions that would have global repercussions. You know how other countries, both allies and rivals, react to this kind of power shift. Would it lead to more stability, or would we see new tensions emerge? It would be fascinating to watch.
It's like dropping a giant rock into a pond. The ripples would spread out in ways we can't even fully anticipate. But, okay, let's shift gears to culture, because that's where things get really interesting, I think.
Absolutely. We touched on this fear of Canada losing its unique identity, but could it also work the other way around? Could an influx of Canadian culture actually change the U.S.?
Ooh, I like that angle.
Yeah.
So instead of just assimilation, we could see a fusion of sorts. What would that even look like, though? Would American TV suddenly be overrun with Canadian sitcoms? Would hockey finally overtake baseball as the national pastime?
Well, maybe not that extreme, but on a more serious note, it raises interesting questions about how cultural integration actually happens. Is it about adopting each other's customs and traditions, or is it more about a blending of values and perspectives?
And how would that impact things like arts, literature, and music? Would we see a surge in cross-border collaborations? Or would artists kind of retreat into their own cultural corners?
Those are fascinating questions. And it's worth noting that cultural integration isn't a one-way street. Just as Canadians might worry about losing their identity, some Americans might feel apprehensive about a perceived Canadianization of their culture.
Right.
It's a two-way street.
It makes you realize how much national identity is tied up in these seemingly small things. The music we listen to, the food we eat,
Yeah.
the jokes we tell.
Exactly. And when you start merging those things together, it can create a sense of both excitement and unease.
Sure. Okay, so we've talked defense, we've talked culture.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't ignore the elephant in the room. The economy. Let's be honest, this is where a lot of the debate gets heated.
You're absolutely right. And it's where those what-if scenarios get really granular. We already touched on the potential impacts on Canadian industries. But what about specific sectors? Let's take energy, for example. Canada has vast oil and natural gas reserves, plus significant hydropower capabilities.
Right.
How would integrating those resources into the U.S. energy grid impact things like prices, production, and environmental policies?
Would it create more energy independence for North America? Or would it lead to more environmental concerns?
Those are critical questions. And it's not just energy. Think about healthcare. Canada has a universal healthcare system, while the U.S. has a predominantly private system. How would you even begin to merge those two models?
That's what I meant by the recipe analogy earlier. You're trying to combine ingredients
Yeah.
that have fundamentally different properties. Would you try to create some sort of hybrid system? Would one system completely absorb the other? And how would people on both sides react to those changes?
Exactly. Healthcare is a prime example of where things get incredibly complex. And we haven't even touched on things like housing markets, education systems, or even just the logistics of cross-border movement.
It's making my head spin just thinking about all the moving pieces. But isn't that what makes this so fascinating? We're forced to think about these interconnected systems in a completely new way.
I completely agree. And it highlights something really crucial. This isn't just about national interests, it's about people's lives. How would a merger impact individual Canadians and Americans? Would they benefit from increased economic opportunities? Would they face challenges adapting to new systems and ways of life?
It's a reminder that behind all the political maneuvering and economic forecasting, there are real human stories playing out, stories of families, communities, and individuals navigating these massive shifts. And that brings us to a key question, doesn't it? Even if this were possible, is it actually desirable?
That's the million-dollar question, and there's no easy answer. We've explored some potential benefits and drawbacks, but ultimately it comes down to values. What do we prioritize as nations and as individuals? Is it economic prosperity? Is it cultural preservation? Is it political power?
Or is it something else entirely, something we haven't even considered yet?
Yeah. That's the beauty of this thought experiment. It forces us to confront our assumptions and grapple with these complex trade-offs. It's not about finding the right answer. It's about engaging in thoughtful and nuanced discussions about the kind of future we want to create.
Well, you've definitely given me a lot to think about. But before we wrap up, I have one more question. We've talked a lot about the theoretical implications. But if this did happen, what would be the one thing you'd be most curious to see unfold in the real world?
That's a great question. For me, it would be the evolution of Canadian identity within the U.S. Would it be absorbed? Would it be celebrated? Would it lead to a richer, more diverse national fabric? Or would it spark cultural clashes?
That is fascinating. I think I'd be most curious about how the political systems would actually merge in practice. Would it be smooth sailing or would it be utter chaos?
I guess we'll never know for sure, unless it actually happens. But even if it doesn't, I think this deep dive has been incredibly valuable. It's challenged us to think critically and creatively about the relationship between these two countries and to consider the potential consequences of such a monumental shift.
I totally agree. It's a reminder that even the most outlandish what-if scenarios can spark important conversations and lead to a deeper understanding of the world around us. So to our listeners out there, what's the one thing you'd be most curious to see? If Canada became the 51st state, it's really amazing how exploring a wild what-if like this can spark so many different thoughts, isn't it?
It is. It really is.
It's like we've peeled back the layers of an onion, only to find there's like another onion underneath.
Yeah.
Just when you think you've wrapped your head around one aspect, another question pops up, another consequence you hadn't even considered.
Exactly. And that's why I think these kinds of deep dives are so valuable. You know, it's not about predicting the future or coming up with all the right answers. It's about challenging our assumptions and, broadening our understanding of how things actually work.
It's about recognizing that there's always more to the story than meets the eye, right?
Right,
Like
yeah.
even the simplest questions can have so much complexity woven into them.
Yeah, and in this case, it's about seeing how interconnected the U.S. and Canada already are, even without being a single country. I mean, we've talked about the economies, the defense systems, the cultural influences. In a lot of ways, the lines are already pretty blurry.
They really are. It makes you wonder if we're already so intertwined. Would a merger really be such a dramatic change? Or would it just be kind of like a formal recognition of what already exists?
That's a really interesting question. And it's one that, historians, economists, political scientists, they'd probably debate that for decades.
Maybe this whole conversation will end up sparking some new research papers and dissertations down the line. Who knows?
That'd be great.
But speaking of thought-provoking, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored all the buzz around this idea of Canada becoming a state. We've talked about how incredibly complex the process would be, and we've looked at all the potential impacts on everything from politics and culture to the economy and even global affairs.
We even touched on some pretty deep philosophical questions about national identity and what it really means to be American or Canadian in a world where those lines could actually shift.
Right. And even with all of that, we just barely scratched the surface.
Yeah.
I mean, it's clear that there are so many other angles to explore,
Oh, yeah.
so many what-ifs branching off from this main idea.
That's what makes it so interesting.
Exactly.
It's like we've planted this little seed of curiosity, and now it's up to our listeners to, see where it leads them.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge. Don't just file this away as a fun what-if. Take this thought experiment further. Think about everything we've talked about, but also think about the things we haven't even touched on.
Right. What about the environmental impacts, the impact on indigenous communities, the potential for new social movements and political realignments?
Exactly. The possibilities are pretty much endless.
They are.
So let your imaginations run wild with this. Explore those potential consequences, both the good and the bad. And most importantly, let this whole exercise inform your understanding of the real relationship between these two countries. Because even if Canada never becomes the 51st state, just thinking about this possibility can really deepen our understanding of, the complexities, the challenges, and the opportunities that shape the world around us.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well said.
I think that's the essence of a good deep dive. It's not about reaching a specific destination. It's about the journey.
Exactly. So to all our listeners out there, keep those minds open, keep those questions coming. And until next time, happy diving.
Thank you for tuning